Vietnam began making semiconductors in Asia even before global chip leader Taiwan. Its first facility, the Z181, opened in 1979, a year ahead of Taiwan's UMC. Now, the early Vietnamese chips were mostly exported to the Soviet bloc during the Cold War. But when Eastern European markets collapsed in the late 1980s, so did Vietnam's chip industry. We'll explore what Vietnam is doing to reclaim its place as a global semiconductor hub and Taiwan's role in it. I am joined in the studio by Tran Thi Mong Tuyen, a research fellow at the Pacific Forum. She's also a former fellow at Taiwan's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and a visiting scholar at National Taiwan University. Great to have you on the program.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me here today.
Absolutely, our pleasure. Now, let's start with what's happening right now. State-owned technology and defense company Vietel recently broke ground on Vietnam's first wafer fabrication. It's also first indigenous production facility for Vietnam. How significant is this?
I think the Vietel wafer fabrication is a milestone for Vietnam. We can see that is like the long-term transformation. This is not immediately regrew because Vietnam is familiar with assembly, testing, and packaging, but we are still missing some part in the higher value chain in semiconductor. So the fabrication, wafer fabrication is a very complex part, and the part that Vietnam is missing. So I think the Vietel is coming in the right moment, and it's, we also putting that in the context of the broader strategy for the government, because we see that the semiconductor is more like national priority, also the economic security, and when we have our own wafer fabrication, so we can reduce the external dependence. And if we put in this thing in the broader strategy, when you have the wafer fabrication, we are not only just a factory, this is not only, but we have to coordinate with other sectors like institution, R&D, human talent development, etc. So that is also push the other field in Vietnam. We go up together with the wafer fabrication.
So big first step. Now, what's interesting is Vietnam is going to be focusing first on 32 nanometer chips, I believe. You know, comparing that to where Taiwan is at with the advanced chip, TSMC's doing 2 to 3 nanometer chip, most advanced in the world. So it is still a long gap when it comes to the more advanced chips. But where does that place Vietnam once they start producing these chips? Where does it place Vietnam when it comes to the regional competition, or how it sets itself up as a semiconductor hub or supplier?
I think so far we can use the manufacturing that mature technology for maybe for the domestic uses, because like the washing machine is still using that, so it have the different shipment, right? So we cannot compete with the advanced chip like Taiwan or South Korea, Japan, etc. But maybe we can use this if sell with the cheaper price in the mature technology for the domestic use of first.
Now, very generally, Vietnam's semiconductor industry actually started in 1979 before Taiwan's. So why is it now playing catch-up instead of being a global hub or a global leader?
It's about the finance. We have to say first about the capital, because Vietnam's economic is just grow recently. And if we do more focus on the semiconductor building in the past, from you mentioned the long time, so maybe Vietnam is not have enough capability to maintain that time. And now, as I mentioned, that even about geopolitics coming and the foreign direct investment into Vietnam increasing significantly. And for example, like Foxconn, the Taiwanese largest electronic company, they already started more and more establishment in Vietnam. So we rule the existing industry presence, so we can develop the semiconductor by the embedding the domestic capability into the foreign manufacturing located in Vietnam. So that's also the right moment. And the other thing is that in Vietnam now we aim to become the developed economy by 2040, 45, yeah. And so that's also the thing we have to see and see that's the part for the Vietnam government to develop.
Let's take a look at the size of Vietnam's semiconductor market. According to market intelligence firm Mordor, it was valued at just over $10 billion in 2025 and is projected to climb to around $16.5 billion by 2030, meaning an average annual growth rate of over 10%. Now, integrated circuits, or ICs, held 46% of the Vietnam semiconductor market share by device types in 2024. Combined shares of MEMs, or micro-electromechanical systems, sensors, and other components made up the remaining 54%. And then integrated device manufacturer, or IDM operations, accounted for 61% of the market in 2024. The remaining 39% was comprised of chip design or fabless vendors. Now, Tuyen, I just want to understand, so in order to achieve what the targets of the Vietnam government are regarding its semiconductor market and manufacturing, they will have to grow about 10% every year. So where do you think that growth will come from?
I think the first thing is that we have to say about the state-led policy. And recently, like for example, in 2025, and Vietnamese government have the law on science and technology and innovation, and they also have the law on the AI, the law on digital transformation, also amended the IP law, because as you know, if we want to develop in semiconductor, so the semiconductor industry is very sensitive for the technology transfer, so it requires more the IP safeguard. So the government is aware of that, so they have more move in the legal framework and policy, and at the same time they also boost more about the R&D joint research from Vietnamese university with the Vietnamese industry, also Vietnamese university with the foreign company, so boost more about the talent development, because we need the talent for develop the semiconductor.
Vietnam is focusing on components. A big part of it comes from components, MEMS, sensors, and other parts for the semiconductor industry. So how is Vietnam positioning itself, would you say, when it comes within the broader ecosystem? What is its plan with regards to perhaps how, and I think this is something you mentioned, as companies are looking more to diversify away from China, where is Vietnam really trying to position itself to take advantage of supply chains that want to be non-red?
Non-red. So I want to take one recent example about the Foxconn, the Taiwanese company in Vietnam. They just announced that they are going to manufacture the humanoid robot in Vietnam. And the reason outside China, because they also have the large manufacturer in China, but now they moved to Vietnam in that part. So I said that the reason for Foxconn to choose Vietnam to do that important robot, because the Foxconn is very invested in Vietnam for a long time, and now they have like 130,000 of laborers working in Vietnam. So it's become one of their most important local manufacturing. So they also want to benefit from the competitive labor costs in Vietnam. So then their products can come with more competitive price.
Okay, so with regards to the international tie-ups you mentioned, Vietnam is counting on global partnerships to push its semiconductor industry up the value chain. Now, in April, Vietnam's President To Lam met with South Korean President Lee Jae-myung in Hanoi, where the two sides signed a dozen cooperation agreements. South Korea is already Vietnam's largest investor, with major conglomerates deeply embedded in the country's manufacturing base. Now, both governments are looking to deepen that relationship, targeting semiconductors, AI, and advanced tech.
우리 양국은 과학기술 혁신 협력 마스터 플랜을 바탕으로 반도체, 2차 전지, 바이오 분야 등의 공동 연구와 연구 인재 양성 지원을 위한 협력을 강화해 나갈 것입니다. 이번에 체결된 디지털 협력 양해각서는 양국 간의 AI, 반도체 등 디지털 분야 협력을 확대하고 우리 IT 기업들의 진출에도 크게 기여할 것입니다.
how important is this new cooperation with South Korea for the growth of Vietnam's semiconductor market and industry?
I think it is a very milestone for Vietnam and South Korea relation, because if you look at closely to the visit of the President Lee to Vietnam, and you see that he accompanied with him and have 4 chefs of the top high-tech company from South Korea, for example, like Samsung and LG, SK, and also from Lotte. And we see that now Samsung is still the largest foreign company investor in Vietnam. So it's a contributing silicon to Vietnam export product. So we see that Samsung also have more and more investment in Vietnam, and they also build in the R&D joint resort with the Vietnam side. So I think this will have for Vietnam to have more talent development, and also more about the technology transfer. We are looking with South Korea as well.
Now, you also had mentioned the cooperation with Taiwan. Can you talk about a little bit more about the kind of industrial cooperation there is, like you were talking about Foxconn and other Taiwanese companies that are part of Vietnam's ecosystem?
Okay, I want to talk more about like Bigatron, and they also, the Taiwanese electronic companies, also they also give a lot of scholarship for Vietnamese students in the national university, so that those students, they can come to their company to learn directly. Because you know that in Vietnam, we want to develop the talent, but for the semiconductor, but this is still very limited in the capability, because we don't have the real sample, or maybe you don't touch in the real machine. So that's also a challenge for Vietnam, because what you learn, that's more about the theory. But for the semiconductor, you need to have the real industry experience,
the hands-on experience.
Yeah, so it's not about the quantity of this talent, but also about the quality. So that's also the move between Taiwan and Vietnam. And the other thing is that Taiwan, they have the program, it's called Intense program by the Ministry of Education. So they also recruit the Vietnamese students to come to Taiwan to learn more about the semiconductor, and also get the real experience, through their internship, or after that they can get a job in Taiwan in the semiconductor. So that's also like the talent by like exchange.
So is there much? I mean, speaking of, talent is a big problem for Taiwan, South Korea, many places that are now positioning themselves as global hubs in the semiconductor industry. How much interest is there with the next generation in getting into the semiconductor industry in Vietnam? Is the government going to be able to, I think it has a target of about 50,000 students by
2030.
Yes, so yes, exactly, developing its targeted 50,000 specialized semiconductor engineers by 2030. Does it look realistic? And what are they doing? We're hearing about the international collaborations, but what are they doing within Vietnam itself to encourage that?
Yeah, the government put a lot of efforts on the human capital, because we want to build the semiconductor. The first we have to the human capital, and we put the target is have the 50,000 by 2030. But at the moment, in Vietnam have 15,000 of engineers in semiconductor, and among that we have 7,000 of engineers in the design, and the rest is for other part of the field. So I think, as I also mentioned, that the quantity is also not the everything. We also need the quality. So we will see that it's moving more and more, because we need the real industry experience that in Vietnam still lag behind. So we need to build more the international partnership and exchange with the advanced semiconductor like Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, or the US. So that is so far government can do. And for Vietnamese students, they also pay more attention about semiconductor, because and read some statistics that Vietnamese students are good at the STEAM. Yeah, so maybe that's a good starting point for them to look in. Yeah, if the government have a more incentive to favor for the graduate from that field. So, for example, they can get the good pay. So then maybe they can,
isn't it?
Yeah.
You mentioned that there are partnerships with universities and then with Taiwanese companies also investing in students in R&D. Can you talk about any specific R&D initiatives that Vietnam and Taiwan are working on together?
So far, that is R&D, in the deep R&D job is still very limited, but the talent exchange, or maybe not only for the student in the field, but also for the professor. So there is already some Vietnamese professors to go to Taiwan so they can learn more about the experience here, and after that they come back to Vietnam to teach on the field. And also like the Taiwan government also make the sitting, the list of sitting experts from Taiwan. Also the expert professors, they are very famous for the field of semiconductor in Taiwan to go to Vietnam to exchange or to discuss and to have Vietnam to be more in semiconductor industry.
And broadly speaking about the kind of how Vietnam semiconductor could look like or could develop, there's a suggestion that Vietnam could follow Taiwan's model, starting with a concentrated semiconductor clusters like we're seeing in Hsinchu, which is considered Taiwan's Silicon Valley, before expanding nationwide. Is this realistic? Is this what's happening right now?
Yeah, this is what is happening in Vietnam right now. Yeah, and we have in the north where is many tech company concentrate there, also including the Foxconn or many other Taiwanese company, and we are building that area as the Silicon Valley of Vietnam. So I think it's also some kind we can learn from the Hsinchu, like the concentration of the technology park. So that's it also.
Now, at the beginning of this conversation, we spoke about Viettel and how they're breaking ground on the inaugural indigenous facility. But how much private investment is going from Vietnamese companies themselves? And how many, is there much of a startup scene with the semiconductor industry or its supporting components happening in Vietnam right now?
As I know that there's still some start of the private companies they want to develop in semiconductor, but maybe it's a little bit challenge for them because to build the semiconductors, they need a lot of the support from the government. The government now is more open for the private company, but to do something very strategic thing like semiconductor, maybe they need more effort.
How much of an alternative is Vietnam really to China, or is it just always going to be just an external node to what China is already doing?
I think this is very early stage to say that Vietnam can alternative China, because China is a like largest partner of most of country in the world in the manufacturing. But Vietnam can contribute as a meaningful role in that supply chain resilience. Yeah, so like Foxconn, they also move slowly their manufacturing from China to Vietnam. For example, I mentioned to you before they chose China to manufacture the humanoid robot, but now they choose Vietnam. So they move that process slowly, so we can see that the role of Vietnam emerging. But at the same time, it also gives Vietnam the challenge because to build something in higher value, so we need the higher skill labor. And we also need the more cost technology, so that in Vietnam is still depend on the other country. So still a lot of also need to build something very advanced. So Vietnam need the technology ecosystem with high integration. So but Vietnam still lack of that. But we can see that the role of Vietnam is growing. So like Samsung, they also try to build something is more advanced in Vietnam. So they try to embed Vietnam itself in the global supply chain. Yeah, so it will have more for the supply chain security, supply chain resilience. So yeah.
Okay. One thing that Vietnam's managed to do very well, especially with the growing US-China rivalry and tensions, is walk a middle line, do a balancing act, both managing US interest and China's interest and maintaining relationships on both sides. How is Vietnam doing that?
Because we try to diversify the multiple partner. We not too much aligned. We're not allied with any single country. Depends on a single cluster or a single segment of a semiconductor. But we try to the strategy that we try to combine the strength of each country and which one is benefit for Vietnam and how Vietnam collaborate with them in that. So we can reduce the external dependence. But at the same time, Vietnam also built its own domestic capability. So it's at the same time they can sustain themselves. Yeah.
So what kind of technology transfers are we seeing between Vietnam and Taiwan?
And so far, the technology transfer between Taiwan and Vietnam is still very limited. Yeah, but we expect from Vietnam side, we expect to see more the technology transferred from Taiwan for Vietnam, so that the Vietnam can upgrade its industrial industry and also for the technology learning, so Vietnam can embed it in the higher segment of the value chain. But I do understand that for the technology transfer in the semiconductor, it also need the IP protection have to meet to the international standard. So like last year, the government already amended the IP law of Vietnam to more focus on the semiconductor. So it will gain more the trust and confidence from the Taiwanese company to do the technology transfer to Vietnam. But not only the Taiwanese company, but maybe for others partner of Vietnam to do the technology transfer. So we hopefully to see it's more come in the near future.
And infrastructure gaps, regulatory hurdles, as you said, supply chain vulnerabilities all still exist. What key reforms are needed, would you say, for Vietnam to be able to overcome a lot of, what it'll face when an industry is just beginning?
First thing I have to mention about the infrastructure. Yeah, the government, because for semiconductor, we need more about the logistics, about the engineers, supply, and also about R&D, the human resource, and everything. Also have the industrial park, etc. have to meet the international standard that is specialized for the semiconductor. So the government is working very hard on that. So you see that like the last year, Vietnam already merging 63 provinces to 34 provinces, also merging the ministry together, which is more specialized in one field, so they have more effective to work on the paperwork. So that's it I want to mention about the regulatory reform needed. Also take a bit of time because they just merging, so it's take more time for them to coordination. And you mentioned the other thing about geopolitics sensitive. Because now you see that the semiconductor industry also saved by the major power competition, especially the US and China rivalry. So that is how Vietnam to navigate in the major power competition, also challenge for Vietnam. Yeah.
So looking ahead, do you envision what do you think the Taiwan-Vietnam economic and technology relations will look like as Vietnam moves up the value chain for semiconductors?
So looking ahead, so I think the economic and technology of Taiwan and Vietnam in the future it will be deeper and more structured and more ecosystem based. So we have to say that because Taiwan is a deep expertise in the semiconductor and Vietnam is rolling in the semiconductor, so both sides can be complementary for what they need. For example, the Taiwan, they're looking for the diversified manufacturing, the benefit from the competitive labor costs, and also to secure the supply chain outside of China, so Vietnam can contribute to that side. But at the same time, Taiwan also contribute for Vietnam in the side I mentioned, like human capital development, also for the technology transfer. That's the aspect we want to look at more and more, or the deeper R&D research, joint project between both sides. So that's the relation I can see is more coming more. But of course, at the moment, Vietnam is not about to compete with Taiwan or in the near future. But this is the relationship is not only one way. If Vietnam is not only attraction Taiwan, but at the same time we also contribute for them. So we see more like evolution relationship, partnership.
When do you think the first chip is going to come out into the market? When do you think Vietnam will actually start becoming a place where it can start either supplying its own chips or export it to the rest of the world?
I think the domestic company already started to do that, and maybe they already have their own chip and also export to the market, but in very limited time. And what we want to see that is the more and more advanced thing, so then they can integrate in the local network. So hopefully we can see, based on the evidence of the government, so that it may be like for 5 years more, or maybe in the next 5 to 10 years. So we can see some more advanced chip will come from Vietnam. But of course, this is, again, I mentioned is we're not going to compete with Taiwan or South Korea, and that's such advanced chip, but maybe in a higher what we have in now.